We begin tonight with an I-team investigation. One of the hot topics at the state capitol is whether a compromised state budget should include a bailout for Hartford.
The capital city says it needs $40 million in additional state funding to pay its bills. And some are saying no matter the cost, bankruptcy must be avoided.
Today, Hartford Mayor Luke Bronin told us he is still looking at solutions that avoid bankruptcy.
It's very important to stress that any sustainable plan has to involve all stakeholders. That path is not available unless we have a new partnership with the state of Connecticut that includes significantly increased revenues.
But Chief Investigative Reporter Eric Parker spoke to two men who think bankruptcy would actually be the best thing that could happen.
And he's here tonight with the beginning of a 5-part series on the capital city in crisis. Eric?
Mark and Denise, no question, the idea of bankruptcy is a scary one. It's scary for the city, its residents, employees, retirees, you name it, even the suburbs. It's a scary thought. But some say it should actually be embraced. The I-team recently traveled to Detroit, Michigan, and we talked to the two men who led the largest municipal bankruptcy ever. They have a simple message for Hartford. Get on with it.
Abandoned buildings, decaying roads, and tens of thousands of burned out streetlights. Those were the symbols of Detroit's despair. As the auto industry that sustains this region crumbled in the early 2000s, the long, slow decline of a once proud American icon picked up speed.
The city really wasn't a city at all. It was spiraling toward oblivion.
By 2013, Detroit was broke. Things got so bad that sometimes it was upwards of an hour before an ambulance responded to an emergency. But rock bottom led to a new start. That year, Michigan's governor appointed Kevin Orr, a Washington, D.C. lawyer, to be the city's emergency manager. And soon after, Orr took the city he now single-handedly controlled, into bankruptcy.
The goal was to get Detroit through the bankruptcy as promptly as we possibly could.
That filing brought Stephen Rhodes and Gerald Rosen into the picture. The two federal judges became Detroit's guides through the maze of restructuring. Judge Rhodes oversaw the case in federal bankruptcy court. He appointed his friend and fellow judge Jerry Rosen as the mediator, tasked with bringing all the interested parties together in a compromise that would end the case and give the people of Detroit their city back.
There was great anger in the city about it. People didn't like having their democracy taken away from them.
So the judges tried to move quickly. First, they figured out the city's assets, how much cash was on hand, how much tax money was coming in, what property did the city own that could be sold. Then they figured out everyone the city owed money to. The court calls them creditors. It could be a vendor, someone who bought a municipal bond, or even a city retiree living off their pension. Then the court took all the available assets and paid creditors some of what they were owed. The rest of the debt was wiped clean. The idea is to come out the other side with a brighter future, and the judges felt to do that, they needed to work fast and find compromise.
And if we didn't get a fully consensual, or almost fully consensual plan of adjustment, the city would have been in bankruptcy for years.
The biggest boon for Detroit is what they now call the grand bargain.
The state, the art, the pensions.
And it started with this doodle from Judge Rosen. The city owned all the art in the Detroit Institute of Art, and he knew the creditors would demand that art be auctioned off to pay the city's bills.
I didn't want my legacy to be, the guy who helped sell off one of the world's great art collections to sheiks in Dubai and oligarchs in Russia. So I began to think of maybe a way to leverage the art to bring in outside revenue.
He came up with a plan to put the contents of the museum into a trust that could then solicit donations from nonprofits all over the country to make sure the art stayed accessible to the public. The money raised by that trust was transferred to pay the city's pension liabilities. It was such a success, it raised hundreds of millions of dollars to keep the art in the museum. And the doodle that Judge Rosen sketched out ended up there too.
This is a reproduction, and this is hanging at the DIA now.
Today, Detroit's downtown is bustling. Abandoned properties have largely been demolished, and those burned out streetlights have been replaced too. So we asked Judge Rosen and Judge Rhodes to do some digging on Hartford's financial woes.
It looked to me as if Hartford was simply piling more debt upon existing debt. That's really a recipe for disaster.
The judges noted the well-publicized budget shortfall in Hartford and the city's request for millions in additional aid from the state. Both men felt a state bailout would be a big mistake, especially with the upcoming increases in pension payments that would tie up huge percentages of the current city budget.
Legacy debt is the death beetle for a municipality, or for a state for that matter, because it grows and it grows exponentially. And that's what was happening in Detroit.
And the judges say the signs are all there, from the budget deficit to the city's bond rating falling to junk status and worse. They say if you don't believe them that bankruptcy is practically inevitable, just look to the professionals who just downgraded Hartford again last week.
This is a reflection of the judgment of professionals about the creditworthiness of the city.
But Hartford doesn't have a building full of city-owned Van Goghs, and without the grand bargain that saved Detroit, is bankruptcy still the best idea?
I think virtually every municipality has its own grand bargain that it can find. There are assets that can be consolidated and monetized in any number of ways. Budget cuts, which I know Hartford is already doing.
But their biggest advice is to avoid a short-term fix like a state bailout that just delays what these two experienced bankruptcy judges say is inevitable in Hartford.
Kicking the can down the road doesn't solve everything. The problems are just going to get worse.
It's going to be hard, but if the city needs a fresh start, the sooner it gets started on that fresh start, the easier and more efficient it is.
Now, we told you the first step for Detroit was the appointment of an emergency city manager who became the sole decision maker, essentially taking all the power away from the mayor and the city council there. The judges said having one person in charge made things move faster, and they think that was a big part of Detroit's success. But in Hartford, the I-team questioned if Governor Malloy would take power away from Mayor Luke Bronin, his longtime ally. The judges had an interesting suggestion. They think Malloy should take power away from city government and then appoint Bronin as emergency manager, authorize him to file for bankruptcy as soon as possible. An interesting idea.
Yes, my goodness.
Well, it's an interesting look at the whole prospect of what's playing out here.
We went out there just to look at what happened in Detroit, and we came back with a story we weren't expecting. One of revitalization, hard times. There's no sugarcoating. We have 4 more parts in this series. We're going to talk about business interests. We're going to talk about retirees who certainly take the brunt of the cuts and feel it because it's their income.
And the whole stigma thing, too.
It is. And then we talked to a realtor from a very wealthy suburb of Detroit who says things have never been better in the whole region. It's really interesting. We look at Central Falls, Rhode Island as well. All week we're going to be having our reports. No matter whether you live in Hartford or a suburb or anywhere in Connecticut, you have to watch this. It's really interesting stuff, and I think it's going to be a big part of the conversation going forward.
People like to think it doesn't impact them no matter where they live in the state, but it certainly would.
It does, yes. All
The
right.
future of Hartford's tied to all of us, and what big decisions are being made right now.
All right, we look forward to your next 4 reports.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Eric.
Eric.